Unwitting Conspirators. The Way. In a time not so far off, in a place just adjacent to us, lay a land where when its contents stole things, physically perturbed other living creatures, or turned the truth into a secret, the doer of these deeds would slowly harden to stone, burn to ash, or disappear into nothingness. It was still unknown whether they withered away or simply vanished to live eternity alone, since no one else had ever spoken to those ever again. In any event, the symptoms were sure to show steadily, until the deed was repaid or somehow undone to replace balance to the equation. Over time and upon reflection, it was assumed throughout the population that so long as the one experiencing the symptom was repentant for their actions, it was possible for its consequences to be negated. The jaded would say, "Why would you wish to inflate a bad situation by telling the truth to an unwilling victim? It'll just further hurt them." In selfish, false compassion, they began to spin new narratives. And yes, their supporters would sing, "Why inject the innocent with a mess they never asked for? Haven't they already endured enough? Doesn't it seem the infectors inevitably walk away feeling less dejected by the weight they've created? Let them sit in it. Who needs forgiveness?" In the end, they celebrated, claiming it was time for a change. A day and age to accept the way of the flames, the stones, and the invisible ones only the leaders seemed to have heard from. And over time, the system deteriorated, fading along with social engagements. Each component reflecting the fruit of self-inflation that had risen to champion them in a defining moment. After one too many situations had played out violently, this just do them a good deed later deal seemed pretty sweet, and so became a popular theme. It was even promoted as the most polite way to handle grippy fingertips, disagreements, or slips of the tongue, creating a subtle disconnection. For a while, kit gloves seemed to work like a dream, bearing no clear consequence for reacting to circumstances. Eventually, the old types began evolving the ability to twist things so elegantly, it was impossible to tell the difference between these and their previous reality. Since the public now believed it was better to handle things secretly for the sake of peace, a new reality began to brew. One of a good deed being the return for some unnamed objectable thing spread drunkenly through their towns and city streets. This newfound capability allowed them to play with the system. They began hiding behind the guise of good deeds. Exchanging gifts became the way of apology, an outlet offered by the guilty party for the guilty party's release from the heaviness and burning accompanying their misdeeds, while leaving the unwitting receiver to question its motivation. Their comprehension of the new stipulation causing further affliction. For a time, the population operated this way, as if it were normal, under tables and in back alleys, until they lost track of tallies, the best of them never showing any signs of deterioration, inflammation, or emptiness. Inevitability is key to universally historic poetry, and this land's was no different. Since everybody played by the same rules, to know the system's inner workings came with an underbelly. the knowledge presenting the ever-living dilemma running through the veins of humanity. In the end, if you hadn't guessed, the fools became suspicious whenever someone was generous, and in effect, could never enjoy even a genuine gift when given. The naive developed a bad habit of inviting those who'd present them with the best gifts. They'd receive them even if they came with a flood of excuses, until the pattern exposed its delusion, leaving them to be washed up in a deluge of emotion before evaporating quickly into thin air. It was rare for these poor creatures to last long in this reality. They were often beautiful and then gone. The angry became infectious, looking for outlets to spread their projections, seeing how many stones, ashes, and wasted air they could leave in their wake. In time, the illuminated suspicion over everyone else turned into the illusion that the giver must have first stolen from, cheated, or lied to them, rendering whatever was offered as simply deserved. A peace offering, since everyone knew gifts weren't ever just given for no reason. Because of these trends, the contents began their descent from greatness into fakeness. Over time and generations, good deeds began to happen less and less. It became commonplace to see others with chunks of stone melded in with their face, smoldering appendages or see-through spaces, lacking substance completely. At this time, it had become quite normal to walk past a statuesque stone bearing some variation of the same horrified expression. You'd be hard-pressed to find one smiling, except maybe with the relief of not having to move or lift their heavy feet for the rest of eternity. And while all this was happening, there grew a mother, a father, and a pair of twins, Ren and Jordan, begotten by Joel and Ruth, who wisely closed themselves within to review separate content. From very young, they'd read to their children stories of courage, valor, the importance of family, and so much more that left the two craving. Over dinner, their mother would feed them narratives of heroism, destiny, trial and error, and the pitfalls of vanity. Before nighttime prayers, Ruth would rock them to the songs of love and compassion passed down from generations before them. And once the two were sound asleep, she would often watch her beautiful babies peacefully snoring with tears in her eyes, terrified of the day they might spring their own wings. And how would they fare all alone in a world slowly turning to stone? On this night, she stood in the shadowed frame of the door, but she simply beamed. Something had changed. She'd realized her children weren't wired the same. No sign of tears loomed above her smile as she basked in the notion the two of them were bound to do great things. They would always be safe and sound, she was sure of it after reflecting over the day's exchange. She'd walked them to the park hand in hand, the two nearly skipping with unabashed yet quiet excitement. She'd taken special care not to hinder them with her own fears as she hovered between them like a meadow robin, sheltering her offspring with her own wings, keeping harsh elements lurking without away from them as best she could. She'd been so focused on the road ahead, she hadn't noticed the rickety old woman walking up from behind them. She slowed to a stop to lean in on her cane, to gather her breath for the long stretch still looming. Once the final cart had passed between them, Ren slipped unnoticed from her nervous mother's hand, all the songs of compassion coming one by one into her head. She suddenly thought of the grandmother she'd lost and wondered where this one's children might have been. Why had they let her out of the shelter without so much as an arm to help her stand? She had to use a rickety branch? With tears in her eyes, she rushed to the woman's side. "Dear Mima, please let me take your load at least," she said, reaching for the woman's bag. Her mother had turned in terror. A single interaction could turn one so young and impressionable to stone in a single moment. She froze in fear, realizing the best thing she could do was be brave and let her little raven spread its wings without interference. This was a lesson meant for all of them. Ren hadn't waited for the woman's response. Sometimes heroes are meant simply to help when needed. They are doers of deeds, not speakers of things. She was ready for this. She'd been waiting. Without much resistance and full of surprise, the elderly woman's bulging googlers nearly popped from behind her bifocals as she looked on with wonder at this little one's tear-brimmed eyes. As together they walked across the street, the dear old woman felt as if she were melting. Each step brought more feeling to her feet, and before they reached the halfway point, her loving brother had rushed to join her, wrapping his little arm around the lady's waist carefully while offering hers his shoulder to take off the weight. Each squeeze of the child's hand left her warmer. Each pat on the hand ignited something within she hadn't felt for so long. All the while, hand on her heart, their mother stood smiling behind them, grateful for the sign she'd needed so desperately. They were going to be just fine. Her hatchlings were growing into heroes. By the time they reached the other side of the street, the woman was shining brightly, like the sun reflecting from the surface of a crystal. Her eyes leaked tears she hadn't released in years. They flooded through their portals, revealing the beautiful soul their gift had freed. It sang out for the grown children's children she'd never seen, as the desire to be with them rushed in with a vengeance, the desire to forgive and to be forgiven. And suddenly, she could feel her heart beating for the first time since it had been frozen, betrayed and left alone in the wake of her own shortcomings. Reaching down, she'd hugged them both, and as their mother had approached, she'd turned and embraced her the most. As she pulled away with eyes swimming with all things suggesting their meaning, she'd expressed the most priceless gift a mother bird could ever be given. "Thank you for your children." She wiped her eyes and went her way shining and clearly on a mission. She shifted from her position against the frame of their bedroom door, more grateful than ever and humbled to have been given the recipe for raising heroic children. The end.